Hi everybody, I wanted to talk today a little bit about licet and oportet, which are two impersonal verbs in Latin that are used very frequently. First, let me remind you of what we mean by an impersonal verb. An impersonal verb is a verb that can never have a human being, a person, as the subject. Usually there is no subject expressed in a Latin impersonal verb. Unlike English, where we say, think about a phrase such as, it's raining. This word it is kind of a placeholder. It's not a normal subject. Okay. One way you can pick out impersonal verbs in Latin is that the first and third principal parts are typically third person singular rather than first singular. Okay. And also an overwhelming amount of impersonal verbs in Latin are of the second conjugation. So I want to start with licet, mainly because you've probably already seen licet. Licet means is permissible, or permission is granted. Okay, the structure you've normally seen with this is an infinitive and a dative. The person who has the permission is in a dative. It's a dative of reference. Okay, and the action that is permissible for that person is typically expressed in an infinitive. So for instance, licet tibi legere librum dum cenas. You may read a book while you eat dinner. Literally it means to read a book while you eat dinner is permissible for you. But typically we take this this dative of reference in Latin and we turn it into our English subject of the word may, simply because English is not as fond of impersonal verbs as Latin is. Okay, so that's a construction you probably have already seen before. But maybe there are two more constructions for licet that maybe are less familiar. Another construction is using a subject accusative with an infinitive as a kind of along with licet. So for instance, the sentence I give you, raidos agi intra urbem non licet, that carriages, raidos, agi, be driven, is not permissible inside of the city. Okay. Now, again, there's no subject expressed for licet. You can understand the infinitive agi as the subject, and that's fine. But notice how this seems to apply to everyone. No one can drive carriages. Okay, and again, I want to kind of reinforce the idea that just because you have a subject accusative and an infinitive does not mean that we're dealing with an indirect statement. Anytime you want to express the subject relationship of an infinitive, whether it's an active or a passive infinitive, that subject is expressed in the accusative. That's what we mean by subject accusative. Okay, so again, it would not really make sense to call this an indirect statement. Okay. The third construction with licet is a little bit, probably the most strange. It's counterintuitive, and that it involves a subjunctive. Okay, so for instance, I could say, licet tu me cum ambules. There's no kind of literal translation. You can see that we have a subjunctive ambules. Here it's a present subjunctive because licet is present tense. But notice how if you have a subjunctive going with licet, any express subject of that subjunctive is, of course, in the nominative. That's why to is nominative. So you may walk with me. It is permissible for you to walk with me. Those are both still good translations. Now, what might be perhaps a little bit confusing or unexpected is that there's no conjunction here between kind of the main clause licet and the subordinate clause tu me cum ambules. Sometimes you'll find an ut, but in all honesty, you're not so likely to get that that conjunction ut, and you should be ready just to see a subjunctive pop up along with licet. Okay, might make sense also to say that that there's no word order that's really important. I could have said tu me cum ambules licet, not a problem. Okay, let's move over to another impersonal verb. Maybe you've seen it before, but as Romans were very much interested in following the rules and doing one's duty, it shouldn't be a surprise that there are a few different ways of expressing obligation. Okay, and oportet is one of the go-to ways to say it. Now, again, this is usually communicating an idea that English would express with should or ought, which are not impersonal verbs in English. Okay. Now, unlike licet, you don't use oportet with a dative and an infinitive. There's no dative of reference. Okay. Rather, there are only two possible constructions. One is with that subject accusative and an infinitive. Okay, so militem cum virtute pugnare oportet. Maybe if you want to be grossly literal, you can say something like, it is important, or it is imperative that a soldier fight with valor, or simply valiantly. But it probably is just easier to take this subject accusative of the infinitive and turn that into your subject of should or ought, or was supposed to. That would work fine too. Okay, so that's one way that oportet works. Oportet will also can also have that construction that we saw with licet, namely that subjunctive. Okay, so I could have expressed the same idea that we just saw also with a subjunctive clause. Oportet miles cum virtute pugnet. Okay, again, it's translated the same way. A soldier should, or ought to, or is supposed to fight valiantly. Notice again, if I ever need a subject of a subjunctive, I have to have a nominative. Okay, nominative is always the subject of a subjunctive. Again, the word order is fairly flexible. I could have said pugnet cum virtute miles oportet. But I want to stress that miles here is not the subject of oportet. Miles is the subject of pugnet. Okay, I could have had an ut to introduce that subjunctive clause, but again, I would say you probably only see it 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 times, if that. So you should be ready to see oportet simply with a subjunctive clause. And finally, I want to just mention, like, well, what happens if you have a clause with licet or oportet in an indirect statement? Again, these verbs don't have nominative subjects. So when you make an indirect statement, you're not going to have a subject accusative and an infinitive. Okay, so here are a couple different ways of using these two impersonal verbs in an indirect statement. Scio licere tibi in silva ambulare. I know scio. Okay, now I put my form of licet into the infinitive, licere. And then kind of the rest of it is the same. I can use any construction I want once I get to that point. But notice how kind of there's no subject accusative here with licere. Okay, I know that it is permissible for you to walk in the woods. You can understand ambulare as this infinitive kind of as your subject of licere. That will work, but just kind of make sure that you're not looking for some sort of accusative noun or pronoun. Similarly, here's another one. Quis dixit oportere legionem in castris manera. Who said that the legion should wait in the camp? Okay. Now you see that legionem and you might be thinking, oh, maybe that's my subject accusative of oportere. No, that legionem is your subject accusative of manera. Okay. Because oportet usually has a subject accusative and an infinitive. Again, we can have several, if you have oportet or licet in an indirect statement, you can have several infinitives, and it's usually not too hard to figure them out, to sort out the infinitives. Okay, so that is our quick overview of licet and oportet. Thank you.